On behalf of myself and Monica Hakimi, the other editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law, we'd like to welcome you to AJIL Explainers. The series is designed to provide expert information and commentary on international law during Trump 2.0. We're thrilled to say that this episode features Anna van Aken on The View from Europe. Anna is a renowned professor of law and economics at the University of Hamburg. Anna, thank you for joining us. And let's begin by asking, what is the view from Europe on Trump 2.0?
Thank you so much. Thanks to Professor Hakimi and Brunk for organizing this webinar. And
okay,
I would also like
I found this on the web for the series is designed to provide.
Oh, what was that? That wasn't just me, right? It was everywhere, I suppose.
I think my iPhone was responding to something you said. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, must be AI. Again, my thanks to you both for organizing this webinar. And I would also like to thank the AJIL and the AJIL for formulating their strong advocacy for I quote the AJIL president, Melinda Hodgson, rules-based system, a world that prioritizes right over might and respect for life. So in order to give a view from Europe, one has to position Europe. Europe is, of course, highly diverse historically, linguistically, culturally, politically. Not all countries are members of the European Union. Those are 27 member states. Yet most, except Belarus and now Russia, are members of the Council of Europe, with 46 member states. Both the EU and the Council of Europe were founded after World War II to end wars in Europe, which for centuries have been torn apart by wars. The Council of Europe was founded on the principles of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Among its bodies is also among international lawyers, renowned European Court of Human Rights. The EU defines its core values as respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, respect for human rights, including those of minorities. And now here comes the point. Those principles were and are considered critical and necessary conditions for upholding peace between European nations and beyond. Europe is founded on a deep belief in peace through law, including international adjudication to settle disputes peacefully. And Russia today proves the founders right. European countries have understood that international relations are positive-sum games. You give or you lose sometimes. You take and you win sometimes. But overall, all countries are better off together. Europe has stood as a normative and economic power, not as a military one. The latter being one of the greatest concerns now. With the first Trump administration and truly the second, the belief that the US shares those values is shattered. And given that Europe views itself as a normative power, the loss of shared norms is devastating. Europeans look with sadness and astonishment on the developments in the United States, the disregard of the rule of law internally and internationally. Certainty of law is displaced by uncertainty and fear as a Trump brand and as an instrument of power for people, companies, and states alike. The expectation that the US stands beside Europe is shattered, and with it, trust in the transatlantic alliance. The non-committal reaction to the US after the drone attacks on Poland 2 weeks ago has not helped. As French Senator Claude Malhuret from the center-right party in France had put it, Europe is fighting a dictator, Putin, supported by a traitor, Trump. And I think this feeling is widely shared in Europe. All this comes in a very difficult time for Europe. The financial crisis, the debt crisis, COVID, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. And the rise of nationalist populist parties in many European countries mimicking the happenings in the US. Yet, strategic autonomy, as called for by President Macron in 2017, is now taken seriously. Europe needs to pull itself up by its own lederhosen, as I would call it. So in my essay, I build on this basis to deal with three issues where Europe has been especially concerned by actions taken by the Trump administration. If you're a believer in the peace through law approach, the cracking of the normative foundations of the international order, Trump's attacks on international courts and international organizations are profoundly unsettling, also beyond narrow European interests. And here, 2 points come to the fore with which I deal in the essay. First, free riding on multilateralism, that is the US actions that paralyze multilateralism and demonstrate the zero-sum thinking and free riding on the provision of global public goods and commons. And second, the US conduct and statements that ignore central pillars of international law, going from cooperation to anomie and forced deal-making. And more targeted also on Europe, the US activities that destabilize Europe itself through political meddling directly or indirectly through economic weakening, think tariffs, which encourages right-wing populism, think 1930s. And I stop here and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. And I guess first question I'd like to ask is on your point about sort of Europe looking at the second Trump administration with some degree of sadness and astonishment. And my question is really, why wasn't Europe more on notice of the trends in the United States and even prepared for the possibility of a second Trump administration after the fact that we had an earlier Trump administration that in some ways the Biden administration, some views are that the Biden administration did not exactly reverse course on a lot of the Trump administration's initiatives, and that even the Trump administration's initiatives reflected to some degree some of the intuitions of the Obama administration. And so given this sort of this view that the United States was like moving in the direction in which it has now lurched for quite some time, what is it about the current moment that seems so surprising or shocking to European audiences?
Well, I think, look, first of all, I really have to accuse the Europeans of sleepwalking. Not all of them. I think so the call for strategic autonomy, for example, by President Macron was done in 2017, so in the first Trump administration, right? And I think we can talk about security, but there was a long, it took them quite long to move, right? And Trump has been very clear in his first administration that the Europeans need to beef up, for example, their own military budgets. And I think rightly so. But the Europeans come historically from a, we rely on the US. The US is our friend. We stood by the US after 9/11, fighting with them alongside in Afghanistan. So when the US invoked Article 5 of NATO, of the NATO treaty, the Europeans went along and they were there. And so they were expecting the same thing would happen, vice versa. And I think in the second Trump administration, what has become very clear is that absolutely not is it sure that the US will stand with the NATO members and think Baltics, think Poland now, if there is really an attack by Russia. And the fear is real. So I think Europeans have been sleepwalking, and the second Trump administration really makes them wake up. I think the second thing is, which is difficult for Europeans, is this sort of erratic reciprocal tariff war. I mean, even before, and we know this because we had the decision by the WTO appellate body on the first Trump administration, the steel tariffs and stuff. The second one is pretty erratic, and it doesn't adhere to any economic logic. It's politicizing international trade to an extraordinary degree. And so I think neither the exit from the Paris Agreement was unexpected, nor probably the exit from the WHO, because, you know, that was clear. He was pretty clear he was going to do that. But the whole attack and the force of the attack, also on multilateral institutions, think the sanctions against the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that was shocking. And on top of that, we look at what's happening in the US internally, right? That is somehow, if you think you share the values with the United States, and that's the way I was raised, then that was especially shocking. And I'm not saying, and you know, we all know the discussions on the Iraq War in 2003, where already some European states said, no, we are not going to join you on that. But I think the extent in which this, the second Trump administration has shifted on all those points is somehow unprecedented.
Anna, I want to follow up on a piece of Monica's question, but before I do that, I want to flag this idea that the Trump's tariffs have no economic logic, so that we can come back to that. I wanted to follow up on that, so we can just save that for later part of the conversation. But on this point about Europe being on notice, I mean, isn't the real danger here not that Trump represents some external threat to European normative values, but that those values are under threat internally in pretty significant and profound ways already, right? Like Hungary, like Poland, like the fact that Europe is ever shrinking, right? That Russia is no longer in Europe, that Turkey was going to be in Europe, but Turkey isn't in Europe, that the UK is no longer in the European Union. I mean, isn't that, and isn't that another reason for maybe there shouldn't have been much of a surprise here? The real reason that this is so threatening is because the threat lives within Europe?
Well, I think that's partially true, but I think where the Europeans, at least, you know, the non-Trump aligned Europeans, and again, it's politically diverse, but I think what the important thing to see is that there was never such an extent of political meddling. Think about the meetings before the German elections with the far right leader Alice Weidel. Think about the rather unveiled pressure on the Polish electorate to elect the right-wing president, because otherwise it might impact their security, given that they're so afraid of Russia. You know, I think this is pretty unveiled. And then, of course, you have much more under the surface people from the Trump administration or from his team coming over to Europe and advising the right-wing parties on how to manage their elections. So I think the meddling has been quite stark. And second, from what I read from the press, there's also some sort of covert action going on in Greenland. You know, I mean, this thing, okay, we're going to annex Greenland and we want to have it, if necessary, by force. And, you know, you're like, whoops, you know, you're basically saying you're attacking your NATO ally. So that's a bit bizarre, but there seems to be covert manipulation, indoctrination going on in Greenland. So this is more the Russian type of acting. So I think this is also shocking, and that something like that probably wouldn't have had to happen under Biden, nor under Obama, or anything like that, right? So there's really this rupture in how to behave in international relations.
It does raise an interesting set of questions about the principle of non-interference and where the line, you know, we're talking about international law, where the line is between a government just encouraging a party that it likes abroad versus where have we crossed the line with non-interference. And I'll just, doesn't diminish your point. I will say, as a matter of international law, I think that line is pretty fuzzy. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think the way it is done so openly, and now I think Brazil, Trump obviously didn't like that, or doesn't like the Supreme Court in Brazil, and obviously, shredding tariffs, and basically, I mean, we are talking high tariffs here, right? If there's no action taken against the Supreme Court, and Bolsonaro. So to basically let him go free, and that is pretty much an obvious meddling. I'm not saying states never meddled, but this is pretty tough. And of course, the European Union or Europe takes note. And by the way, one thing I would like to say, I mean, we still consider Russia to be Europe. It's not out of Europe. I think Russia has always been a European power, also historically. So it remains in Europe, and I would think also Turkey would be understood as a European country. So it doesn't change whether they are still members of Council of Europe, or which Turkey is, of course, but or the EU. So.
Yes, thank you. I just obviously meant the expansion of the multilateral institutions. Monica, should we pivot to, I want to pick up on a theme in your essay, and we should note that these webinars are based on a series of essays in the American Journal of International Law coming out in October on contemporary practice of the United States in Trump 2.0, and the link to Anna's essay is in the chat. I highly recommend the essay. It's very good, and again, it's part of a series. But I think we're going to want to pick up a little bit on this idea of free riding and what that means. Monica, do you want to take that up?
Sure, thank you. So I guess this is really a request for elaboration on the idea, and two questions sort of came to mind. The first is, in what way actually is the United States free riding or beginning to free ride on international institutions? One view that you hear in nationalistic circles in the United States is that the opposite is the case, that the United States has for too long supported and itself maintained a system on which many others, including in Europe, have free road. And so the claim that actually now the United States is turning into the free rider is one on which I think our listeners might want some more elaboration. And then the second is related to it. How are the forms of free riding new in the Trump administration? If some form of the free riding is, as I think you articulate in the essay a little bit, oh, well, the United States is like sort of no longer supporting or has never supported certain international treaties, has opted out of them, certain international regimes has opted out of them. This, again, some would say is a long-standing trend. And so the question is both like, what do you mean by free riding, and how is that significantly different in the current moment relative to whatever the US practice over the past 15 years or so?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. So I think there's 3 points here. So when I use free riding, I use it in an economic sense. And economists use free riding when they talk about global public goods, or if think health, think climate, climate change, or there can be normative public goods as well, which could be international criminal law, right? So I think there are 3 ways in which this free riding is taking place. And before I say that, yes, absolutely, you are right. I think the states also have free ridden on the US efforts to build this order and to provide those global public goods. And when the US exited the WHO, I was looking at the budget, and I'm not just the mandatory contributions, but overall, I think now I need to remember it well because I taught it with my students in summer. Something about 20% or over 20% of the budget of the WHO was paid by the US, which is fantastic, right? So I think we clearly need to state that the US has been contributing to a lot of global public goods more than it would have needed to do, right? So kudos for that, for sure. But what's happening now is that when we think about commons, that is one thing where we don't talk about free riding, but rather overuse. And commons, or, areas of common heritage of mankind, like the deep sea bed or the moon, they can be overused or taken. And commons work only if everyone restrains themselves. If you see that someone else runs to the commons and exploits the commons, then everyone else will run as well, because otherwise they think, okay, we are losing out, we're not going to get anything. So with the move to exploit the deep sea bed, that sets a strong incentive for other states to do so as well, just as if you want to put a nuclear reactor on the moon, it sets a strong incentive for states to do the same thing. Having said that, China wanted to do it as well before. But the risk is that breaks down the cooperation on those global commons, and then they are not there anymore. Okay, so that's one risk, and this risk really has been accelerated by the US moves under Trump 2.0. The second, I think, move, which is also unheard, the US was active in negotiating the Rome Statute for the ICC and then never ratified, but now sanctioning the court's members is again quite unprecedented in that way, right? So, so I think those two moves concerning global public goods and commons is rather new by the Trump administration. Just not participating, just not contributing, that's okay. And I do understand that there are people in the US saying, hey, come on guys, we have paid for such a long time now, let us go, right? But for also climate change, this, when we exited in the first Trump administration, China and the EU issued a statement the other day saying, we will hold up the cooperation. We will continue to have climate change. And I think the signal was very important to all states, because cooperation on global public goods is conditional. You cooperate if others cooperate. If you think others will not cooperate, meaning the public good will not be provided, or in the other case, on the commons will not be protected.
So it sounds almost then like it's not just a free riding problem, it's sort of a problem of the destruction of the commons, a purposeful destruction of the terms of the commons that is actually going to accelerate its destruction.
I don't know how purposeful it is, but I think what we know from research, if you have, imagine you have a pastry, right? And one is coming every morning and taking all the stuff, and all the cows are grazing all the grass. Then what would the other farmers do? They say, well, we go even earlier, right? We also want, because our cows also need to eat. And this is the same thing which we see now. It's the same principle. And then they get overused, and then they're dead. And so I don't know how purposeful it is to destroy the commons as such, but I think that will be the effect, and the US just doesn't care.
I just want to pick up on very briefly on the two examples two of the examples you used, just to kind of think about the context more broadly. I mean, when President Biden embraces the work of the ICC when it has to do with Russia and Putin, and dismisses the work of the ICC when it has to do with Israel and Gaza, is that, I guess that's not free riding? I don't know. Is that free riding? I mean, and it's just a broader point. It seems that U.S. engagement with international law and international institutions has long been selective, opportunistic. Questions about deep seabed mining, like, were part of the negotiations of UNCLOS, and are part of what has prevented the United States from joining UNCLOS, consistently across decades of Democratic and Republican administrations. So I just, part of this essay series is to try to think really hard about what's new, and it doesn't strike me. I see the specific things you're talking about are in some sense new, sanctioning ICC judges, but isn't the opportunistic sort of willingness to destroy the commons in order to advance U.S. interests, I mean, how new is that?
I guess, and I agree. I mean, that concerning some sort of hypocrisy, the Europeans are sitting in a glass house, that's for sure. But I think the massivity of all those measures together, plus the attempt to weaken the checks on the executive branch, and now I'm thinking about the trade courts, right? So putting all this tariffs, something which is obviously challenged within the US, but kind of and no, to me at least in that respect, that's the first, much better happening in the US. So you have a president or an administration which is getting rid of internal checks and balances as far as possible, and then acts on the world stage with no restraint and no international legal restraint. And I'm not saying, Biden, we were not happy him saying that but European leaders did so as well, that they weren't happy with, say, ICC. But taking active sanctions, I think, is a step further. And I think it's a massivity of those two issues that at the same time, so quickly, so many things in international law get attacked. And at the same time, there is no, what you usually have with democracies, you think, okay, you might have a leader who's stepping beyond the bounds, but at the same time, Trump is trying to dismantle those internal checks and balances, and that is a bit shocking, I think.
Could I take the conversation in a slightly different direction, Ingrid, or do you have a follow-up there? Different direction. Okay, so let me ask you the question, Anna, of the relationship basically of Europe to the current administration. So taking everything you said about how there does seem to be, at the very least, a sea change in US practice and the European perspective of on US practice. Like, I guess one question that I have is about what Europe is going to do in response. So, on some level, you could say, like, well, President Trump is just changing the terms of the game. And he's basically saying the United States is no longer committed to this sort of value-oriented multilateral approach. It's much more brass tacks, interest-based. We're going to use the hard power we have to get what we want. And so the question becomes, like, is Europe seriously considering either the kinds of concessions that it might make to the United States or the ways in which it might show the United States, like, look, we actually have value to you and you have an interest in us, and sort of proving itself in some sense to be a valuable partner to this form of American foreign policy, or willing to say, you know what, this is true. Like, we are different. You have moved in a different direction. We no longer share the same values. You're no longer committed to the kind of international normative order, legal order that we see as necessary, and therefore we are going to distance ourselves from you and sort of go our own path. Like, because I think those two seem like the options that President Trump is sort of putting on the table for Europe. And I'm wondering how Europe is thinking about whether those two options or whether there are others that might be available to sort of try to weather this storm. Because as you say in your essay, and as you said, and as we've discussed before, Europe is in a very difficult spot and is facing a number of crises, both internal and external. And so President Trump is sort of like putting it in a position of having to decide in which way it's going to go.
Yeah, thank you, Monica, for that question. So I think I would like to pick two things. One is trade, one is security, because they are deeply intertwined. And let me put this first. If Europe would have moved earlier on security and on a common, as we used to call it, common defense community, so the EU, I think they would have been tougher with the trade talks, where they basically sort of fell, right? I mean, they avoided a bigger thing, but the original reaction of Europe was no, we are not going to be bullied. We are going to stand firm and da da da. And then they make the deal after other countries already had made their deals, which is somehow problematic because it is most probably not adherent to the WTO norms. Okay, it's not a free trade agreement, which is what you could escape their most favored nation clause. So it's undermining a central pillar of the WTO, and the EU had always said, we are for the WTO. We want the WTO to function, and we are going to adhere to their norms. So in this case, I think they fell, and I think they did so because they know that we cannot survive currently, at least, without US help. And you have seen this in the moment that the US stopped intelligence sharing and delivery of military equipment to Ukraine. And then, I mean, if they would have done this longer than those 3 days or 4 days, probably Ukraine would have been in a very difficult position. So the EU currently, in its reactions, tries to equilibrate those two things, right? I think where they're going to go, and they've already done so, is rearm Europe. So maybe one little word on the history of European security and defense policy. It came very late, and it always came in the shadow of NATO. So NATO was the main pillar of European security, but NATO is, of course, dependent on the US. So the EU never really, also because the UK always wanted NATO to be the main pillar. Now the UK is out of the EU, but coming back in somehow because they're also seeing what's happening. But the common security and defense policy has been the last policy area where the EU came together, okay? And it's still very fraught. So because also they didn't want to double NATO structures, so they always deferred to NATO. And I think what we will see most probably, if Trump doesn't take a very determinative turn to say, I'm standing to my treaty obligations, what you will see is that they will probably not have an open rupture with NATO, but substantively NATO will be hollow. And it will be the EU building up. So now we have this rearm Europe with billions and billions and hundreds of billions of euros being put into European defense, building up European defense industry and all that stuff. So that's a reaction on security. Europe has deficiencies. As far as I read, the French have it all, but in bonsai form. Right? They have everything but it's too small but we need to scale it up, and the French stand at least under President Macron stand ready to do so if there are other Europeans would do so, including the nuclear protection for Europe. On trade, look, the EU is the continent or the organization with most trade treaties in the world, over 70. But there's still room for improvement. So we will probably see one between EU and India. Hopefully the Mercosur agreement, the EU-Mercosur agreement will be ratified soon. So I think Europe is trying to diversify also to the Middle East, away from the US. Having said that, I think for Europe, it came a little bit at the shock because the trade deficit, and this is what I said in the beginning, it doesn't make sense. If you look at the trade deficit, you look at goods and services. If you include the services, the trade deficit of the EU with the US is very, very small because the US has a high trade surplus in services with the EU. So if you include it all together, there's not much why we should have tariffs, right? And so if you care about your balance, I think on trade they're also trying to diversify. I think it's going to take time, but if I look at the EU-US relationship, and I think I'm saying this not as a Trump fan, so and there are other Europeans, that's for sure. if Europe stays on the path of liberal democracies, and some of them will go up and down, like Poland, Hungary, there's strong opposition now, so Orban might very likely lose the next election, so Hungary is going to be back. Other countries will go to the far right. So, it's always hard to say, but I think it's a likely path. So if Europe stays predominantly with liberal democracies, it's likely that they will get much more autonomous on security and defense, and they will diversify trade away. Now, the problem is now, in the short term. In the long run, I don't see any problems, or not many. As long as they stand firm on their values, which they're obviously not always doing. As someone has put it, it was a business conference. Europe is going to win this if they stay with capitalism and humanism.
You answered my question about the sense in which the Trump's trade policy was irrational. So thank you. That makes sense in terms of the European balance with respect to services. Do you think there's it seems to me when you look at Trump and his trade and other policies, he's betting on U.S. economic power and U.S. Military power as drawing in trade partners, drawing in relationships, including with Europe, even if the normative foundations are eroded. Right? So he may not share Europeans' normative commitments, and yet Europe is going to come back and want to trade with the United States just because of our economic power. I think and it's an interesting calculus, right? It as an IR theorist or as an international law scholar, the sort of generations of value of soft power, in a sense, or the value of these norms. I feel like we're living in this experience where, he's like, I haven't read any of that IR theory. I just want you to come buy my stuff. And even if I have a reputation for being someone who violates treaties or walks out of them, you're still going to come back to me and buy my stuff and want to negotiate with me just because of the power of the United States. Do you see it that way? And also, I took your very last point to be that's not going to work in the long term, right? That might work for President Trump now, today, in the short term, while Europe gets itself together. But in the long term, Europe is going to trade and work in ways that promote its normative values, not just its economic agenda. I'm just interested in your response, whether that's a fair appraisal, either of the way things look now or the way you see things going in the future.
Look, it's interesting because for European companies, I mean, I don't want to be in that business, but I think they had turbulent times. So they had to divest from Russia, right? So Russia, even though it wasn't such a big market, but for some companies it was important. And out of that, then you de-risk from China, right? So companies start going, not all of them, of course, but overall you see divestment in China. Also because Chinese moves, right, on putting regulation, having legal uncertainty, etc. And now you have to divest from the US if you take economics seriously. Why? Because, and that we know, the rule of law is an incredibly important determinant of economic development. Now, the interesting thing is with Trump that on the face of it, and interestingly, today there was an AJIL talk by Fuad on the dual state. And it comes back to a book which was written in the 1930s by a Jewish lawyer who talks about the dual state. So the classical property right protection and all that, at least if you're a non-Jew, right, that works. Labor law works, police works, the security is there. But overall, what you see is a complete politicization of the markets. So Trump has one remark on social media and the market moves. So the uncertainty which we see in US-American uncertainty, and all this is measured, right, by, for example, the IMF, but there are several organizations which measure uncertainty. Uncertainty are like it's the biggest tariff you can have. Business does not like uncertainty. So if you have an administration which goes from here to there and here to there, they like you, they like Manos, they don't like Manos. No, this is not how the market works. Markets needs certainty and some sort of prediction. And I think this is where this idea of Trump with his tariffs, well, then they're going to invest because, then they avoid the tariffs. I think this is going to work only to a small extent. I mean, he's putting a lot of pressure, and there have been companies that they saying that they will invest, others will not do so. I mean, it's all about talking, right? I want to see those investments happening because and maybe for some companies it's necessary to survive. European companies, it's necessary to survive, but I can tell you one thing, I'm sure they don't like to do it. I think this idea of we are such a great economic power and this is why we can do whatever we want to do. No, I think that is changing. They're a big market, they're an important market, but if you are afraid that your investment will be cut from one day to the other because of any political issue, you don't go there, or only if profits are really high. I mean, this is a normal risk return calculation. So. The other thing, which I think is highly hazardous, is the undermining of the independence of the Fed. And you could see this in the market, right? And the dollar weakening. So all those are components which will weaken the place of the US of being a good investment destination.
Thank
so
you.
Let's see what the Supreme Court decides.
Yeah.
We're waiting for it.
And actually I should just note that subsequent webinars are going to talk a little bit more about the tariffs and trade policy and all of that. So we'll continue this conversation with other authors who are contributing to this special issue. So Anna, maybe we could end by asking you this question, which is, so we've talked a bit about now some of the internal threats within Europe or the internal dynamics within Europe. We've talked a little bit about how it's trying to manage the current storm and put itself sort of on a different trajectory over the long term. And you end your essay by saying, like, look, it's up to, and you end your essay by saying, look, it's up to Europe to fill this space and to maintain, as you said during this webinar, its commitment to certain values and certain interests. And so, as you said, capitalism and humanism. And if Europe can maintain that path, it will come out ahead. And I guess one question is, like, how confident are you in Europe's ability to maintain itself as an entity in its current formation and actually to put itself on that better as opposed to worse trajectory, given the sort of the immediate storm that it has to navigate in order to get to that position?
Look, that's a hard question, Monica. And not only for me, I think for many people in Europe. I think one thing is for sure, if we have too many of right-wing nationalist populist parties, we cannot exclude war in the long run in the core of Europe, right? We have had that for centuries, and this is why we built those institutions. And there was this understanding, and that seems to go missing now. I try to be optimistic. It depends on, for example, how far I'm not going to be accused of restricting free speech, but I think it does depend on how far we can capture disinformation. Influence. I mean, we do know Russia is doing a lot of influencing. We do know China is doing a lot of influencing. We do know in Greenland, at least, the US is doing a lot of influencing, but maybe also in other countries. Not only overtly, because overtly they are doing it, but positively, right? That can sway elections. And if there are too many countries falling, we can't hold the negative spiral. And that makes me afraid. I don't dare a prognosis. I just hope that every one of us who do not want to live in a world like this speak up now collectively, so that we can somehow stem the flow and be aware and try to become aware of what's at stake and what can be lost, for which our grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandfathers and forebearers died and fought, which is democracy, which is human rights, which is freedom of speech on both sides, but a peaceful speech. So I think that is important. And I hope that enough people have this awareness, and especially the young generation, right? Because it's about the young generation. Look, if it's one of us, we lived our lives. We were lucky. We lived in a great period, but our children have to deal with the consequences, and that is something which I admit does keep me awake. But I want to be optimistic, and I think we can do it.
Thank you, Anna. I'll speak for myself and say that you are tremendously inspirational, and you've been a very influential and important member of the board of editors for the American Journal of International Law. So we are collectively extremely grateful to you, and appreciate the words of optimism at the end. And if you agree, Monica, with that, I think we'll conclude the webinar.
Yes, and on this, as on virtually everything, Ingrid also speaks for me in saying as much. So thank you. And thank you for this conversation. It's been really illuminating, and I'm sure our viewers today and those who will view this later will really appreciate your remarks.
Thank you so much to Monica, to Ingrid, and to you. Thank you for giving me the possibility, because I think it's an important topic. And let me say one last thing. I'm positioned as a German and as a Western German. I wanted to say that in the beginning. I didn't, and I appreciate that there are other Europeans who might have different views, but I tried to give as best as I can an overview on a European view on the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining today. We will be sharing the recording of this conversation within the next week. Full archives of AJIL and AJIL Unbound can be found on the journal's website at cambridge.org/AJIL. And just many thanks again to the speakers and to the audience for your time today. Bye.